What if the first permanent English settlement in America nearly vanished within just a few years? Welcome to Robert's History. I'm Robert, and today I invite you to step back into the fragile world of Jamestown, where survival was never guaranteed. If you value honest, thoughtful storytelling, please subscribe and join our growing community for future journeys into the past. Some visuals in this video are symbolic and may not perfectly match every detail, and I truly appreciate your understanding. I hope this story offers you a reflective and relaxing escape. On the 14th of May, 1607, a small group of English settlers stepped onto the muddy banks of the James River and founded what would become Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. When we look back at this moment, it is tempting to see it as the confident beginning of a future nation. In reality, it was a fragile experiment shaped by uncertainty, fear, and hope. The site was chosen mainly for defensive reasons. The settlers wanted a location that enemy European powers could not easily attack. The river offered deep water for ships and a measure of protection, but what seemed strategic on paper quickly proved dangerous in practice. The colony was established during a period of climatic instability known as the Little Ice Age. Winters were colder, weather patterns unpredictable, and growing seasons unreliable. For people already unfamiliar with the local environment, this made survival far more difficult than they had anticipated. The land itself posed serious problems. Much of the surrounding area was marshy and brackish. Drinking water was often contaminated. Mosquitoes thrived in the wetlands, and disease spread easily in the humid climate. Illness became a constant presence rather than an occasional setback. Most of the settlers were not experienced farmers. Many had expected to find wealth rather than cultivate it. Faced with an unfamiliar landscape and limited agricultural skills, they struggled to produce enough food. As supplies dwindled, the colony became dependent on resupply ships and trade with indigenous communities. From the very beginning, Jamestown was not a story of easy expansion. It was a settlement balanced on the edge of survival, shaped by environmental hardship, limited preparation, and the hard lessons of reality. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became the darkest chapter in the early history of Jamestown. Historians remember it as the starving time, and when we look closely at what happened, it is hard not to feel the weight of human desperation behind those words. Several forces came together at once. The colony was already fragile, and the colder conditions associated with the Little Ice Age made food production even more uncertain. Crops failed. Hunting became unreliable. The river, which had once promised abundance, could not compensate for the shortages on land. At the same time, the Virginia Company had failed to provide consistent and adequate supplies. Jamestown depended heavily on ships arriving from England, and delays or losses at sea had devastating consequences. When supply lines faltered, there was no safety net waiting. Tensions and conflict with indigenous communities further disrupted access to food. Trade became dangerous or impossible. The settlers, who had never achieved true self-sufficiency, suddenly found themselves isolated. As winter tightened its grip, conditions deteriorated beyond anything the original investors could have imagined. Colonists slaughtered livestock and horses to survive. When those sources were gone, they turned to whatever they could consume. Contemporary accounts describe people eating items that were never meant to be food. Modern archaeological evidence supports the reality of extreme starvation during this period. The human toll was staggering. More than 80% of the colonists died from starvation and disease within those months. Jamestown was reduced to a shadow of itself. By the spring of 1610, the few survivors decided to abandon the settlement. They sailed down the James River, ready to leave the failed colony behind. Then, in a moment that feels almost unbelievable, they encountered a supply fleet arriving just in time. With fresh provisions and new leadership, they turned back. Jamestown survived, but only barely. Beyond hunger itself, disease became one of the most relentless enemies at Jamestown. When we talk about survival in the early 17th century, we are not just talking about food. We are talking about bodies pushed to their limits, immune systems weakened, and communities living in constant physical stress. Malnutrition played a devastating role. When people do not receive enough nutrients, their immune defenses begin to collapse. Even illnesses that might otherwise be survivable can become fatal. During and after the starving time, many settlers were already severely weakened. In that condition, infections spread quickly and recovery was uncertain. Death often followed what began as a minor sickness. The environment around the James River intensified these dangers. Much of the land was marshy, with brackish water and poor drainage. Standing water created ideal conditions for mosquitoes and waterborne pathogens. Drinking water was frequently contaminated. In a period long before modern germ theory, the settlers had limited understanding of how disease spread. They lived in close quarters inside the fort, which only increased transmission. What makes this story even more sobering is that the suffering was not limited to the English settlers. Indigenous communities in the region were also affected by the same climatic instability associated with the Little Ice Age. Colder conditions and unpredictable weather patterns disrupted agriculture. Crop failures did not respect cultural boundaries. Food shortages affected native communities as well. At the same time, contact between Europeans and indigenous peoples introduced new disease dynamics. While Jamestown struggled with its own outbreaks, native populations faced epidemics linked to European arrival, often with catastrophic consequences. The result was a shared landscape of vulnerability shaped by climate stress, food insecurity, and infectious disease. When we picture early Jamestown, it is important to see more than a wooden fort. It was a place where environment and biology intersected in brutal ways. Cold seasons reduced harvests, hunger weakened bodies, illness swept through crowded spaces. For both settlers and indigenous communities, survival was never guaranteed. It depended on resilience, adaptation, and at times simple chance. The relationship between the English settlers at Jamestown and the indigenous peoples of the region was never simple. It was shaped by uncertainty, negotiation, fear, and necessity. When we look at it honestly, we see both conflict and dependence existing at the same time. In the early years, the colony relied heavily on trade with native communities for food. The settlers had not yet learned how to grow enough crops in an unfamiliar environment. Corn from indigenous farmers often made the difference between survival and starvation. Without that exchange, Jamestown would likely have collapsed even sooner. At the same time, tensions were constant. The arrival of the English disrupted existing political and territorial balances. Competition over resources, mistrust, and cultural misunderstandings led to violence on both sides. As conflict intensified, trade became unstable. When access to indigenous food supplies was cut off during periods of hostility, the colony's food crisis deepened. These disruptions were one of the factors that contributed to the severity of the starving time. It is also important to remember that both communities were living through the same environmental pressures. The colder conditions associated with the Little Ice Age affected harvests for native farmers as well. Disease and food shortages did not affect only one group. Indigenous populations also faced epidemics and instability in this period, some linked to contact with Europeans. If we step back, we can see a shared landscape of vulnerability. Both societies were navigating climate stress, limited resources, and the consequences of sudden contact. Their relationship was shaped by cooperation and conflict, but beneath it all was a fragile struggle for survival that neither side fully controlled. In August 1619, another turning point unfolded near Jamestown, one that would shape the future of North America in ways the settlers could not yet fully see. Around 20 Africans from the region of present-day Angola were brought to Point Comfort, not far from the colony. They had originally been captured by Portuguese slave traders before being taken by an English privateer ship and transported to Virginia. At first, their legal status in the colony was not clearly defined in the way slavery would later become. Some were placed within a system that resembled indentured servitude, yet it was already deeply shaped by racial distinction. They were forced into labor, primarily in the expanding tobacco fields that were beginning to anchor the colony's economy. Their arrival was not a minor footnote. It marked the beginning of a profound structural shift. As tobacco cultivation grew more profitable, the demand for labor intensified. Over the following decades, colonial law hardened. In 1640, legal decisions, such as the case involving John Punch, signaled a move toward lifetime servitude based on race. By 1660, slavery in Virginia had been formally legalized and defined in racial terms. When we reflect on 1619, it is important to see both the human story and the institutional consequences. Those first Angolan men and women were individuals with identities, histories, and families, yet their forced arrival became the foundation of a racialized system of slavery that would endure for centuries across North America. This moment stands as one of the most consequential chapters in the history of Jamestown and in the broader Atlantic world. After years of instability, Jamestown began to find a form of economic footing through one crop that would change everything. Tobacco became the foundation of the colony's long-term survival. What had started as a fragile settlement struggling for food slowly transformed into a producer for the Atlantic market. John Rolfe's successful cultivation of a strain of tobacco that appealed to European tastes created a reliable export. Demand in England and across Europe grew rapidly. For the first time, the colony had something that could generate consistent profit. Land along the James River was cleared and planted. Ships that once carried only desperate supplies began returning with valuable cargo. Yet this economic stability came with deep consequences. Tobacco cultivation required intensive labor. Large tracts of land and a steady workforce became essential. At first, much of this labor came from indentured servants from Europe. Over time, the system expanded to rely increasingly on coerced and enslaved African labor. The plantation model began to take shape, tying land ownership, wealth, and forced labor together. Tobacco did not erase Jamestown's early suffering, but it altered the colony's trajectory. It provided revenue, attracted new settlers, and anchored Virginia within the wider Atlantic economy. In many ways, this crop allowed the settlement to move beyond pure survival mode. Jamestown endured not because its early years were easy, but because tobacco reshaped its economic future and secured its place in colonial expansion. By 1676, Jamestown had survived famine, disease, and decades of uncertainty. Yet another crisis emerged, this time from within the colony itself. Bacon's rebellion exposed deep tensions in Virginia society and left a lasting mark on Jamestown's future. The rebellion was led by Nathaniel Bacon, who challenged Governor William Berkeley's policies, particularly regarding frontier security and relations with native tribes. Many colonists on the western edges of settlement felt unprotected and economically frustrated. Their grievances turned into open conflict. What began as political tension escalated into armed rebellion. In September 1676, the conflict reached a dramatic climax. Jamestown was deliberately set on fire by Bacon's forces. The capital of the Virginia colony burned, reducing much of the settlement to ashes. For a place that had already endured starvation and hardship, this destruction carried powerful symbolism. It showed that instability no longer came only from the environment or external threats, but from divisions within colonial society itself. After Bacon's death later that year, the rebellion collapsed. Jamestown was rebuilt, and colonial authority was restored. On the surface, the town continued to function as the capital, but something had shifted. The destruction highlighted weaknesses in its infrastructure and its political centrality. Confidence in Jamestown as a stable seat of government began to erode. Although the town physically rose again, its long-term position was no longer secure. Over the following decades, attention gradually moved elsewhere. The rebellion did not immediately end Jamestown's importance, but it accelerated its decline. What had once been the fragile beginning of English America was now a capital whose influence was slowly fading. By the end of the 17th century, Jamestown no longer stood at the center of Virginia's political life. Decades of environmental strain, fires, disease, and structural weaknesses had taken their toll. Although it had survived rebellion and reconstruction, confidence in the town as a permanent capital continued to fade. In 1699, the seat of government was officially moved to Williamsburg. The decision was not sudden or symbolic alone. Williamsburg offered a more favorable inland location, healthier surroundings, and room for organized expansion. For colonial leaders, it represented stability and progress in ways Jamestown no longer could. For Jamestown, this shift marked the beginning of the end as a living settlement. Once the political center moved, residents gradually followed. Government buildings were no longer maintained with the same urgency. Homes fell into disuse. Over time, the town that had once carried the fragile hopes of England's first permanent colony slowly emptied. It is important to understand that Jamestown was not destroyed in a single dramatic moment at this stage. Instead, it faded. The river that had once brought ships filled with settlers and supplies now flowed past a quieter shoreline. By the early 18th century, Jamestown had effectively ceased to function as an active town. What remains today is not a bustling colonial city, but an archaeological landscape. Through careful excavation and research, historians and archaeologists have uncovered foundations, artifacts, and burial sites that speak to the realities of the 17th century. The site, now preserved and studied, allows us to see beyond myth. Jamestown stands as evidence of struggle, adaptation, ambition, and consequence. When we reflect on its decline, we are reminded that not every capital remains permanent. Some places shape history intensely for a brief period and then yield to new centers of power. Jamestown did exactly that. Today, Jamestown is preserved as part of what is known as the Historic Triangle, alongside Williamsburg and Yorktown. For many visitors from the United States, Britain, Australia, Canada, and across Europe, walking this landscape feels less like visiting a monument and more like standing inside the fragile beginning of a complicated story. The Jamestown Rediscovery Project has played a central role in reshaping what we understand about the site. Archaeologists have uncovered the original fort foundations that for years were believed to have been lost to the river. They have excavated the remains of the 17th century church tower and revealed burial sites, tools, weapons, and everyday objects that bring the early colony into sharper focus. These findings do not romanticize the past. Instead, they confirm the severity of the crises described in written records. Evidence of extreme food shortages has been uncovered, aligning with accounts of the starving time. Human remains show signs consistent with malnutrition and hardship. Artifacts connected to conflict remind us that colonial expansion involved violence as well as ambition. Jamestown also stands as a site where the origins of racial slavery in English North America can be examined with honesty. The arrival of the first Africans in 1619 is not treated as a footnote, but as a foundational turning point. When we visit or study Jamestown today, we are not simply observing ruins. We are confronting the beginnings of systems, struggles, and identities that shaped the Atlantic world. The ground itself holds the evidence. Jamestown is not a story of easy success. To me, it is a survival tragedy marked by staggering loss of life. It stands as evidence of how climate instability during the Little Ice Age shaped human fate. It marks the beginning of racial slavery in English North America and reminds us of the brutal cost of colonization. This history reflects environmental crisis, poor leadership, conflict with indigenous peoples, and the rise of systems of injustice that lasted for centuries. I would truly value your thoughts on this. Please share them below and subscribe to Robert's History so we can continue exploring the past together.